general, it is a God-given right that Somalis should be able to stand up and speak their mind. Hence why any discussions involve a great deal of time to allow everybody that chance to stand up and be heard. What we can see in this picture is this process underway, a traditional shir. A group of nomads gathered on the edge of a village, huddled round a tree in a circle so everybody is facing each other, and each person in turn will stand up and debate an issue, debate their point, put across their point of view, and it is their right to be listened to. And this is crucial to understanding what happened at Borama. Because then, this tranquility that had existed for quite some time was broken in the 1980s when a war of attrition was begun by the dictatorship in Mogadishu against the people of Somaliland. These the bones of 56 young men near Burao were symptomatic of what happened during that period. People were rounded up, tortured, shot, simply for belonging to a different group to that of the ruling party. And that gave rise to an organisation called the Somali National Movement. And the Somali National Movement was a liberation army which I think is probably unique in that it received no formal backing from any other government or any other country. It was a people's army. It was funded by the community and it was therefore owned by the community. It didn't receive arms and money and so on from other nations. There was a little bit of support from Ethiopia, but fundamentally, when the army wished to engage in an activity, it went to the elders. This is a meeting not far from Hargeisa Airport, where the community elders are coming together to raise sufficient funds so the local army can launch an attack against Hargeisa. And likewise, the management of the Somali National Movement, although there was a leadership, there was a chairman, Ahmed Salanya was one of those chairmen, the current president of Somaliland. In effect, the day-to-day running of the organisation of the Somali National Movement, its military operations, were determined by the people. Some of those people sat in London or Washington or Abu Dhabi, sending their wages, sending some of their social security money to support their relations who were fighting in the bush. So it was a very democratic institution. And therein lay some of its weaknesses, because it was so democratic that on occasions its efficiencies were called into cause. But it also, during this period, and especially from 1988, when the Serbari forces had attacked Hargeisa and Burao and sent the civilian population fleeing into the hinterland, the survival of those people was dependent on the re-emergence of the power of the elders, of the Gurti. So the traditional structures which had bound Somali society together prior to the arrival of the colonial powers re-emerged. They were given a reinvigoration by this crisis that had emerged. And this is how we arrived at the situation in the post-war era in the 1993, where the Gurti were able to essentially turn to the political powers that be and say, you have failed, you have not done your job, we are taking over. They dismissed the government and they created the Shirki Borama, the Elders' Peace Conference in Borama. So it was the power of this Gurti that had survived, that had endured through the colonial era and enjoyed this re-emergence at the time of the Somali National Movement. And here you can see two of the principal players in that Gurti. Haji Abdi Warabi on the left is still alive and still playing a very active role in affairs. Now the meeting, to the casual observer, was chaos, but there was a method to it, and that method, going back to those people gathered under that tree, was exactly the same. Borama was chosen because it was one of the few towns and cities in the Somaliland region that had not been decimated by the war. And this was the secondary school in Borama. It was the only venue that was suited to the gathering of this number of people. It was also strategic because the people of Borama had not participated in the Somali National Movement war. There had been one or two representatives, but they were essentially more likely to have been allied to the government forces. So there was an element of reconciliation occurring as well. And the people of Borama took great pride in the manner with which they hosted this meeting. And it was also significant that at the time, UNISOM, who was the UN force in Mogadishu that was tasked with the role of trying to reunify Somalia and create a government to replace the overthrown forces of Serbari, was fundamentally opposed to what happened in the financing, the food, the accommodation was all provided for by the community, either the businessmen in Borama or the wider diaspora or members of the Somali communities elsewhere in Somaliland. So this was very much a hands-on, indigenous, locally grown peace initiative. And in fact, there were those within UNISOM who actively opposed it. UNISOM representatives were not allowed to attend. There were one or two, Edward very kindly said I was the only foreigner there. There were one or two other people, I think there was somebody from Save the Children, who dropped in for a day or two. But I was certainly the only person present during the crucial periods in the winding up of the meeting when what we are seeing here was the preparation for the election of the new president and vice president. But the manner in which this conducted was very much crucial, was this Gurti that had enjoyed this resurgence during the SNM era. But it wasn't an SNM meeting. This is the important thing to also remember. The SNM had, in the eyes of the majority of its members, done its job. They had one single purpose, and that was to liberate their land from oppression. And having done that, they then turned to the politicians to try and create a new, stable society for them to live in. And the decision had been made in May of 1981 for the formation of Somaliland. Now, 91, sorry, yes. Now, what we see here is dissent. Not everybody was in agreement. As you would imagine, when you have 2,000 people or more standing, speaking, arguing, debating, this is actually the day of the final election, the day when the elections were held for the presidency and vice presidency. And this is Umar Ati Ghalib, who, together with the outgoing president, Abdurrahman Tour, who is just visible over his right shoulder, had taken exception to the realization, well, they made the realization that the mood amongst the voters was not in their favour. After months of debate, after months of negotiating and discussing future, a consensus was beginning to be formed as to who people would prefer as their new president. And Omar Ati Ghalib had recently come from Mogadishu, where he had been taking part in attempts to revive the government in Mogadishu, and had seen an opportunity, along with some of his supporters, to perhaps acquire influence in Somaliland. And to his horror, he realised on the morning of the election that this wasn't to be. So he attempted to halt the election process. And what you see on the left is Daoud Mohamed Gheli, one of the secretariat for the Gurti, imploring him to sit down and abide by the wishes of the majority for the election to proceed and for him to participate. In the end, he left the election hall in the hope that that would then nullify the whole event, but in fact it didn't. The Gurti met, they debated the issue, and the chairman of the Gurti on that day, which was allocated on a revolving basis, decided that the election should proceed. So that was an example where the Gurti settled a grievance, settled a difference. It resulted in one person or two people leaving, but the majority consensus held. And this is the actual vote for the new president, followed by a second vote for the vice president. Now you will note that there are possibly about 150 people in this room. Now each one of these people was representing a community in the wider Somaliland territory. And they in turn would be representing other people. It's like a sort of a pyramid system. So in terms of how relevant this was to people out in the far-flung regions of Somaliland, it still had, they felt that they belonged to it because these people were representing them and they went back to their communities. So this is in the days before we had a multi-party system. And it was very much an evolution of this pastoral democracy. It was this pyramidal system based on the clan network. And it allowed everybody to feel, even if they weren't holding their hand up at the time of the vote, that they had at least had their views represented by somebody in that room. And by and large, following the election, that was accepted by the majority of the population. And this is the moment when the result was announced, and you see Mohammed Ibrahim Igal in the middle with a kafir, and next to his friend Ahmed Lahwas. I shouldn't say that in Somali. Those are not Somali. So Igal's in the middle being congratulated. And this is Abdurrahman Tour, Now, this picture was taken about 3 or 4 days later because what happened immediately following the election result was that Umar Ghalib and Abdurrahman Tor did not accept the outcome. Now, it would have been possible in many societies, the wishes of the majorities would have just been pushed through. But Somalis don't like to leave a grieving party. Because if you have somebody with a grievance, sooner or later, that grievance will manifest itself in the form of a disruption or a challenge or something. So it was absolutely crucial that in the days that ensued after the election, that the process of negotiation and consensus seeking was pursued, and it was pursued with a vengeance. Until, I think it was on the 5th day, the meeting was reconvened, and back came Abdurrahman Tor, and he made a very magnanimous speech, accepting his defeat and welcoming the incoming president and vice president. And he was roundly applauded for having done so. Umar did not attend that. He, by that stage, returned to Hargeisa and then to Mogadishu. But the important thing was that Abdurrahman Tor did so, and he did it in public. And as I say, afterwards he was roundly applauded for having done what was considered by the majority the right thing. And finally, to conclude, the immediate aftermath of Borama gave rise to the formation of the first parliament in Somaliland. And in those days, there were because Hargeisa had largely been destroyed in the war, there were very, very few buildings capable of hosting such an institution. And this turned out to be the old British court in Hargeisa, which for some reason had survived all the bombing and looting over the previous 4 or 5 years. And this was the inaugural session of Parliament in Hargeisa. And the Gurti, again, they played a crucial role in that. They were you can just see them on the left, and all the representatives are in the right. And they are now electing a Speaker of Parliament. And in fact, what you will see, some of the people in the front row, the gentleman in the white suit, was one of the people who then, in some years to come, formed an opposition movement with Abdurrahman Tor and contested Igal. But at this stage, because of the consensus seeking that had been made in Borama, even those that had been essentially defeated in the elections participated in the opening of Parliament. And from that moment, we now see the current situation where we have probably one of the most fair and free elections of recent times in Africa that was held when Kulmiya came to power. But this is how it all began. So I hope that's given you a little bit of the background. And,